Welcome to Outlaw Bookseller with me, Stephen Andrews, writer, bookseller, collector. And whatever happened to the cyberpunks is the question we ask today. And yes, I know a little while ago, my good friend at Sci-Fi Finds was wearing Mirrorshades on a cyberpunk video, but if you look back on the channel, you'll see that Stephen was doing it a long time ago. But I'm going to take them off now because I can't see anything. I used to use them a lot in a different sort of configuration when the sun was in my eyes, in the glorious early days of the channel when the sun always seemed to be shining no matter where I was. So moving swiftly on, that's the question today. What happened to the writers who were first associated with cyberpunk? And as a yardstick, we're going to use this book, Mirrorshades, the Cyberpunk Anthology, and this is the US paperback edition from Ace, and let's see when it was published. My first copy was a Paladin way back in the day, and yeah, July 1988 and December 1986 Arbor House hardcover. I recall the Arbor House hardcover being on sale at the Worldcon in '87, and it was a rather unattractive book, sort of plain red jacket with a face and a pair of shades, and there was like silver insets, but you know, I should have bought one now, as you do. But this was the book really which codified what cyberpunk was, except of course by that point it had been going on for some years and it was already more or less finished and passé, because of course, as with every genre, they're the artists who are the pioneers who form the tropes and the ideas and the motifs that coalesce to create a subgenre, and then there are copyists who come along and just ape those things. And we've seen this in all sorts of genres, particularly in rock music. If you compare it to heavy metal, the original practitioners of what became known as heavy metal, and we can name any number of them, but let's just say Black Sabbath, Deep Purple, Led Zeppelin, you know, they didn't have a genre name. It's only later on that it became codified. And to me, it became codified when some slightly later bands, Judas Priest, UFO, Thin Lizzy, you can say who you like, they had two guitars, and then it was the people influenced by them who later formed the cliche of the subgenre. And that's very much what happened in cyberpunk. So if you ask me, I'd say there's no real cyberpunk after about 1989. It kind of finishes then. And even though the word is still being used now, just think how long ago that was. It's nearly 40 years. Of course, the names we most associate with cyberpunk are William Gibson and Bruce Sterling. And I'm not going to show you any William Gibson books today. There will be a link at the end to a mood piece I did about Neuromancer to celebrate its 40th anniversary, which of course is this year. And really, I wanted to move beyond that into the other Mirrorshades writers. And if we just have a look through the contents and see who's included in this. And one of the interesting things about this anthology is that when people read it now, it often surprises them who is included and what the stories are like. They're not what they immediately think of as cyberpunk. So inside we have Gibson, of course. We have Tom Maddox, who came up with the acronym ICE, which William Gibson used in the Sprawl trilogy. You know, his work, his novels started to appear later on, and they were greeted with pretty much a stony silence and fell by the wayside. Also Bruce Bethke, who's not in this anthology, whose story Cyberpunk appeared in the early 80s. I think it was in Omni, who gave the name to the movement. His work appeared eventually in novel form, and again it had sort of one or two printings and disappeared, didn't last. But a lot of the other writers in this did endure and still have careers today. We are also looking at Rudy Rucker, Marc Laidlaw, Greg Bear, Lewis Shiner, John Shirley, Paul de Filippo. You know, those are people whose names pop up in here. You also get Pat Cadigan and James Patrick Kelly as well. I don't have any of Kelly's books, so I can't show them to you. I was never that fond of his writing, if I'm honest. And my Pat Cadigans are in a box somewhere, so we'll just have to live without them. But I did do one video in which I talked about her novel Sinners, which is covered in my book 100 Must-Read Science Fiction Novels. So really it's looking at the Mirrorshades writers and what they produced. And as with every genre or subgenre, as soon as you get real artists involved, they immediately want to kind of disassociate themselves from it because they see themselves as individuals and they don't want to be hidebound to any particular formula. And all the writers we're going to talk about today fall into that anti-category. They're not formula writers. But before we start to look at them, just looking at the introduction here by Sterling, which almost reads like a manifesto. He talks about the labels, and he mentions how, of course, writers are not happy with labels, as I've just said. And the words which were often used early on were radical hard SF, the outlaw technologists, the 80s wave, the new romantics, and the Mirrorshades group. And new romantics as in neuro, from neuromancer, as in the neural pathways, your nerves, to me is an interesting one because there's a classic little essay by Norman Spinrad in which he says the cyberpunks are really the new romantics, that they took the quest of the romantics from the 19th century, and that would include Mary Shelley, of course, which is a quest for the sublime, to find the awe and the terror and the beauty of the natural world, but to find it in a new way through technology. So he said, really, they're just romantics. And this is typified by the moments in Neuromancer when Case, who is trapped in a prison of his own flesh, seeks to escape back into cyberspace. The bodiless exaltation, Gibson writes. Without that, it was the fall into his own flesh, and he needed that bodiless exaltation. So it's a kind of romantic thing, a sublime thing. And there is a video on the channel called, I think it's called Mary Shelley Was Never Cancelled, Frankenstein, Cyberpunk and the Sublime, and I talk about that in more length. But just to look at these writers and some of the books they produced, they all went on and did very interesting things. And of course there were people before them, there were precursors, and we could talk about Algis Budrus's Michaelmas, we could talk about Delaney's work where people are jacking into starships, but really we should look first of all at John Shirley. This is City Come a Walk In, which Gibson himself has cited as being a core cyberpunk book. And John Shirley, heck of a great guy. He was, of course, involved with punk rock as well in the Bay Area of San Francisco, which was chronicled in Search and Destroy magazine. And this was one of his earliest novels, and I have covered this elsewhere on the channel. So Shirley is the kind of punk precursor before Gibson and Sterling and the people around them coalesce. And you'll notice also even Greg Bear got a mention, and we just think of Greg Bear as a regular hard SF writer, so that's quite interesting. But I want to talk about the other people involved. My introduction to cyberpunk, or what became cyberpunk, was reading Bruce Sterling right at the very beginning of his career. And this is a book I've shown and mentioned on the channel many times. And this was published in the UK in 1980 and 1977 by Jove. And that's the very wonderful Involution Ocean. And what Involution Ocean does is usually summed up as a short science fiction parody of both Dune and Moby Dick. But what's more important about it is its attitude, its street attitude. It is about a gang of desperate drug addicts on an alien planet whose drug supply runs out, and it's very nihilistic, and it's about their quest to get new quantities of this drug. And it's not a consciousness raising one, it's a burnout amphetamine type thing like crack, and it's called Flare. And you know, it has this attitude. It also has a sadomasochistic relationship between a human being and an alien, and in that way this is almost like listening to the Velvet Underground's first album with songs like Heroin and Venus in Furs. So this comes with a punk attitude from the very beginning, and it's also quite witty in parts as well. It's a great book and very, very creative and amazing world building. So that was my first exposure to what would become cyberpunk, and this book was heavily remaindered in the UK, and it's a real classic. I really recommend you check it out if you haven't. I've mentioned it here countless times simply because I don't see enough people reading it. A few years later, and this was published in 1980 in the States and 1984 I think in the UK, Bruce came up with this, The Artificial Kid, and this begins with the titular character live streaming to a global audience. And you know, this is like 1980, this is years before the internet got going at home. You know, it's 20 years before that, so it's really quite something. So I was primed really by Sterling and really enjoyed his early work, and as I say, John Shirley was there already as well. Shirley had an interesting career. He's still writing, he's written quite a lot, And this is his first book, which is very uncommon, Dracula in Love. So he's dipped his toe in all sorts of things, mostly SF and horror. I'll show you another very, very rare book by Shirley called Transmaniacon. That's a very, very hard one to find indeed. And that reminds me of the song Transmaniacon MC by Blue Oyster Cult, who in the early days, despite being like a heavy metal band, used to be cited as having a punk attitude and great science fiction songs, interestingly enough. Michael Moorcock wrote songs for them, in fact. And here's another Shirley, just to show you a few more. Three Ring Psychus. There you go. And by the late 80s, his work was being issued and reissued in Britain, things like A Splendid Chaos and the Eclipse trilogy. So he's there in the background. Sterling was already there. Sterling went on and wrote many, many other novels, of course. But who else in that anthology stepped up, and what else did they do? Well, let's have a look. Interestingly, one of my favourite writers who came out of the Mirrorshades group, if we want to call them that, and I'm just going to do some repositioning here so you can keep feasting your eyes on that one there we go, is the very wonderful Lewis Shiner. And Lewis Shiner is interesting because here's the person who is most connected to the counterculture prior to punk. And you have to remember that punk really wasn't a big thing in the States, not like it was in Britain, where it was a very, very big thing. And very often his work relates back to the counterculture of the late 60s. Now, his first novel, which came out in the late 80s, is the very wonderful Frontera, which I've talked about again many times on the channel. And this to me is like a combination of David Cronenberg and Barry Malzberg on Mars, and it's got a real hardcore attitude and abrasive and bright, and I absolutely love this book. So if you can pick up Frontera, it's fantastic. But Shiner wasn't somebody who was going to allow himself to be pinned down to do the same old thing, and he did all sorts of things over the years. There's this book, which is almost magical realism, Deserted Cities of the Heart, and that of course is a song by Cream, and I've not read this for years, but when I was reading this, it reminded me of the work of Carlos Castaneda, which was ostensibly non-fiction, the psychedelic experimenter and researcher. And just have a look inside it. Amid the Mayan ruins of Nachan, where it is said the bite of a sacred mushroom can send a man hurtling back in time, 3 people will plumb the very core of their lives. So before you look even further, you see there is a link to the deeper counterculture. And Shiner writes very, very well indeed, and is a neglected figure in my opinion. He has a very sort of small but firm fan base, which includes myself. He's really good at writing about rock music, which most people aren't. This is probably his best known book, Glimpses, which is about a guy who works in a recording studio, and he manages to access alternate worlds where some of the great albums that were never finished, like Smile by the Beach Boys, Celebration of the Lizard by the Doors, can be finished, and he works on them. And that was probably his most favoured book in the USA, Glimpses. Really, really good. He doesn't have much of a publishing history in the UK after his early work, sadly. More recently, Subterranean Press have issued Heroes and Villains, which are some short works by him, which I've had for a few years and I'm yet to read. But I would say anything you can find by Lewis Shiner, pick up and read, because he's always a joy and you can never tell what he's going to do. I mean, one of my favourite books by him, which I've had for a very long time indeed, is Slam, which is set in Galveston. And Slam is the narrative of a chap who comes out of prison. He's been in prison for tax dodging. He's only about 40, and this is the early 90s, and he falls in with some Galveston skate punk kids, and you know, slam obviously is what you do when you come off your skateboard. And this is a really great little counterculture novel, wonderful stuff, full of concrete and grit and abrasiveness, as I say. Shiner does abrasive really well, but he's also very heartfelt, so I would recommend his work. So he is somebody who moved swiftly on and only really ever did one pure SF novel, but boy is it a doozy. So there you go. Also, the very wonderful Marc Laidlaw is somebody who doesn't get mentioned. Before I mention Marc, I should show you this collection of stories by Shiner as well, which is entitled The Edges of Things. So, you know, these are the sort of authors you have to dig to find stuff, but it's always very rewarding when you do. But as I say, I wanted to talk about Marc Laidlaw. I did mention Marc the other day on the channel, possibly in the club room, and he's somebody who is horribly neglected, and yet he's a really, really good little writer. And that's because when he finally produced his first novel, which is this one, Dad's Nuke, which as you see is a Gollancz Yellow Jacket. Let's get it propped up there. You know, he didn't really make much of a splash with that in terms of it being cyberpunk, because it wasn't cyberpunk. It's more satirical and humorous. This is the UK paperback edition from Grafton, late 80s. And this is about urban blight and a period in which people are sort of doing one-upmanship with their neighbours. And the central character in this is the family. The baby is engineered to eat atomic waste, and the dad has a nuclear weapon in his backyard. So it's quite witty stuff. So it's rather like Vonnegut, James Morrow, but sharper, Shirley but more organised, and Laidlaw as well with looking at attitude. And he's a great guy. We used to correspond after I wrote a review of one of his novellas online, and I can't remember whether I got in touch with him or he got in touch with me. It's lost in the midst of time. And he's a really, really good guy, but we corresponded for a while, and it was largely about this book, White Spawn, which is a PS novella, and this must have come out about 15-20 years ago. Let's have a look. I tell a lie. Let's see, 2015, and it's very short, and you can still get this. I mean, it's out to print, but you can find it online. I really recommend it. And if it's anything, I would say it's weird fiction. And it begins with this amazing kinetic opening sequence, which appears to be unrelated to the rest, and is related to it, but tangentially, about a guy driving through like a river valley. And it's just absolutely brilliantly written, and there's something really compelling. You can feel the speed, you can imagine the wind in the guy's face when he's got the windows open on the side. I think it's a van, and it's really quite something. And it's also about a young girl who's just moved to this rural area, and she meets a white-haired boy called Thor who lives in the forest. And there's some very, very strange things in this. It is vaguely Lovecraftian, but in a good way. So if you like weird fiction, things which are indefinable, White Spawn's one of the best things I've read that way, and it's really quite something. And he writes really beautifully. Other things that Marc wrote include Neon Lotus, which, rather like China, has a counterculture thing going on. So for example, there's a computer in this which is disguised as Tibet's patron saint, and it's given a woman a secret mission to look into the reincarnation of a Tibetan scientist. So you get all this kind of Buddhist psychedelic type thing happening as well. So again, you see that linking to the sublime, the need to escape the flesh into something more spiritual through technology, as in Gibson. That's Neon Lotus, a very uncommon book indeed, that one. Just to finish up talking about Marc, I very recently read this marvellous book, The Orchid Eater, from the early 90s. And this is one about two different gangs of kids in California. Some of them have fallen under the aegis of a born-again Christian who believes in tough love and coming to Jesus through adversity. And there's another gang of boys who are all gay, and they are in the thrall of a drug dealer, a gay drug dealer. And there's a conflict between two different boys who are on the peripheries of both of these gangs, and it's really good. And this is set near San Diego, and it's very gritty, and you can sort of taste and feel the atmosphere. It's really beautifully described. Young characters. There's one point where it appears as if it's going to go into something supernatural, but it doesn't. But it's absolutely marvellous. It's described as a novel of suspense, but really it's just sort of an urban noir-y sort of thing. And something at that stage that we were using was the term slipstream, which was really intended to indicate fiction that felt like science fiction, but that wasn't science fiction. And people like Shiner in Slam and Laidlaw in this were sort of key examples of slipstream. Slipstream was great because it meant that authors could step outside the tired genre tropes of SF and show that they could stand up as writers beyond that. They weren't hidebound to those things, and they could blur the edges between the genres as the postmodern world erupted. So that's a really good result. So do watch out for Marc's work. It's really quite something. A couple of brief asides we'll come to at the end. I've got a few brief asides there. Somebody who I'm enjoying reading again at the moment, has just picked up one of his books, is the very wonderful Paul de Filippo. And Paul is a unique talent. He's very irreverent and witty and funny. He doesn't care about being politically incorrect. And strangely enough, his most famous work came up in the mid-90s as a collection of 3 slightly related novels, the Steampunk trilogy, which appeared in the mid-90s. And these are, as it says, steampunk novels. This is 4 Walls, 8 Windows Press, who did lots of really interesting stuff. I'm not sure if they're still going. And this contains 3 novels, and I'm currently rereading the middle one, Hot and Hot, which is a kind of Lovecraftian thing. It involves scientific racism. It involves lots of real people on the peripheries. It's very, very witty, doesn't pull any punches. There's another novel in here about Queen Victoria when she's young, disappearing and being replaced by a sexy newt. And I can't think what the 3rd one's about. Let me just have a look. It's been ages. And in Walt and Emily, it's Emily Dickinson and Walt Whitman hook up, and they travel to another dimension where they meet Allen Ginsberg's lots of poetry involved. This is really, really good fun, great stuff. And Paul's a really fun guy. He's very good at doing that thing of mixing and matching things in the way that Farmer would, but he's got a kind of lighter touch, but he is very irreverent and politically incorrect, which I love. My favorite book by him, and there are many, many books by him, he's very prolific, and I've interacted with him a bit because we both had a story in Deep Ends. I was in the same issue as him, which I was delighted by because that was a real honour, is this book, Roadside Bodhisattva, and this is PS Publishing. I've shown this on the channel before. And this is about a young man who leaves home, goes on the road, he wanders along, he ends up working at this diner where he falls in with an older guy who's a bit of a hippie, and he learns some valuable life lessons about other generations. And this is a great book, very warm-hearted, marvellous ending, not what you expect. If you ever see it, pick it up, it's fantastic. Paul is publishing regularly with various publishers, including PS. This is one of his most recent books, Aota. Gorgeous. You can find that without too much difficulty. Then, of course, there are the people who fell by the wayside, as I say. Bruce Bethke, Tom Maddox, never really came through. Then there are people who, were they really cyberpunks at all? You know, I mean, somebody whose name looms large is Rudy Rucker. Rudy Rucker, of course, was a mathematician. His first book was a maths and philosophy book. And then he wrote his first novel, Space-Time Donuts, which is a very, very sort of naughty kind of take on Brave New World. As it says on the cover, free drugs, easy sex, no job hassles. Some people just don't know when they're being oppressed. And I've just reread this, and it's very, very funny. It's about a society run by a computer. Everybody is drugged up to the gills, but everything's stagnant. There's no sort of creativity, and it's about a group of people who want to get that going again. And there's lots of maths and physics in this. I find Rudy Rucker a difficult read. He's very, very, very much an ideas man. He's a more contemporary kind of John Sladek. If you find Sladek difficult, you will find Rucker difficult. I prefer Sladek, probably because he's a bit more sort of 60s and I'm more that way. But they're in that same ballpark. There's flashes of Philip K. Dick as well, but he has great ideas and very entertaining. His first published novel was called White Light, but this was actually his first novel, which was published second in 1980. Probably the book of his which is most familiar to most people would be Software, the first of the Ware trilogy, which is about robots. And like Sladek, robots pop up a lot in Rucker's work. This is a very rare Rudy Rucker book, which I haven't read. I bought it probably about a year and a half ago from Morris at Zardoz. All you need is books. And this is the 57th Franz Kafka. So this is really short stories. And basically, as I say, he's an interesting guy because he's a cartoonist. He was also related to Hegel, the philosopher. He's something like the great-great-great-grandson of Hegel. And his real name is Rudolf von Bitter Rucker, obviously a Germanic name. So there you go. So if you ever see any of his early work, try him. He is interesting. He is fun. He is irreverent and witty. But he isn't for everybody. And he's on the edges of cyberpunk as well. Somebody who increasingly is getting lumped in with cyberpunk, but he wasn't really. He was tougher, harder, colder, more abrasive, and for my money, the most neglected science fiction writer of the 1980s is the very wonderful K.W. Jeter. This is Dr. Adder, and it is an absolute disgrace that Dr. Adder is not in print. It hasn't been in print for many, many, many years. This is my Grafton paperback from way back in the day. This was written in the early 70s, but no publisher would touch it. And I think Blue Jay did theirs in about 84. This is a few years later. I've got the Blue Jay one somewhere. And it is outstandingly weird. It really, really is quite something. It's very hard to describe. It's about a guy who works on a chicken ranch in Phoenix, Arizona, except the chickens are giant mutant chickens. And he really wants to get out of it. And he goes away to LA, which is in the midst of a battle between a fundamentalist Christian sect and a character called Dr. Adder, who specializes in surgical techniques which are banned. And one of the things that he does is that he performs amputations on prostitutes, because there's a growing market for amputee prostitutes in LA in this future date. So as you see, it doesn't pull any punches. And the plot centers around a little MacGuffin called the Flash Glove, which is an outlawed CIA assassination weapon. But reading Jeter is rather like having your brain rubbed down with sandpaper. It's an experience you don't forget. Absolutely pitiless, lethal, funny in a very black way. Kind of a cross between Barry N. Malzberg and Robert Silverberg and William Gibson, I would say. But really ice-tight plotting. Really, really good. If Jeter were to be associated with anything with the punk suffix, it would be steampunk, because he coined the term steampunk. And he coined it when he was living in Bath, which is where I live. And at that time, he was staying with my friend Les Escott, the founder of Morrigan Press, who published books by Jeter, Blaylock, Keith Roberts, R.A. Lafferty. And he was staying with Les, living with him. And he was outraged by all people going on about cyberpunk all the time. And he wrote a letter to Locus, the science fiction newspaper, saying, my late 70s novel, Morlock Night, is the first steampunk book. And it was a joke. And that's where the term steampunk came from. And it's ironic because, of course, one of the great icons of steampunk really would be Isambard Kingdom Brunel. And Brunel's work, his railways, the Great Western Railway, a lot of the engineering work that Brunel did runs literally past my house. So there's an interesting local connection. But I never met KW. I wish I had. He's a brilliant writer. You should read him. Most people know him through his Blade Runner sequel, which of course was done pretty much just for the cash, and who can blame him, because he knew PKD, and PKD wanted to see this published, but he never saw a publisher in his life because it was ahead of his time. William Burroughs is somebody who comes to mind when I think of Jeter as well, actually. At the very end of the true sort of moment of cyberpunk came Walter John Williams with Hardwired and Richard Cadry's Metrophage. Cadry I've never liked that much. His writing is quite florid and flavoursome, but that aspect of it does seem to be on the surface. Underneath that, I don't think there's a huge amount going on. This was his first novel, and it got quite a bit of acclaim. And I think the Science Fiction Encyclopedia said it's a bit like a bored social researcher with his thumb pressed down on the fast forward button, and you can see it. And he is flavoursome, but as I say, to me there's something lacking. There's a lack of substance in his work, but that's worth looking out for if you're looking for the sort of final wave of late cyberpunk in the late 80s. There were all sorts of great things going on in American SF and British SF in the 80s. It really was, increasingly looking back, a real silver age for the genre. And it was the last hurrah before things got terribly quite dull in the 1990s, at least in my opinion. And somebody who wasn't associated with cyberpunk, because he was writing something quite different, but something equally challenging, was the very wonderful Lucius Shepard, who sadly is no longer with us. This is Green Eyes, his first novel. This is the UK edition from Grafton. This was also published as an Ace special in the USA and as a Chato hardcover in the UK. And Lucius Shepard's first 4 books are all set in jungles. This is about zombies, not sort of fresh-eating ones. It's got actual voodoo in it. They're very Conradian, very Ballardian, jungles, heat, very strange things going on, very flavoursome, beautiful writing. And probably in a way Shepard was arguably the finest writer of literary SF from within the genre in America in the 1980s, but he's tough at times as well. and, you know, doesn't pull any punches, but really outstanding stuff, and sadly neglected. He wrote more fantasy later on. He wrote sort of fantasy and horror as well. His stuff was more indefinable. A lot of it was marketed as general fiction, and in some ways that was the right thing to do. But you can't really fault early Shepard marvelous stuff, and it proves an interesting contrast to Cyberpunk because it's got that flavour and wonderful prose, but not actual cyber stuff in it. So that's just a little look at some of the people who were involved in the original cyberpunk movement, as much as it was an anti-movement, and a lot of them are still writing today. I mean, Bruce Sterling is still turning out works. This is Pirate Utopia from Tachyon Press, and Sterling now lives in Italy, the home of Futurism, and Futurism is the short-lived political and aesthetic movement which really was a kind of precursor of Gernsback's attitude of what science fiction should be. But of course the Futurists got involved with Mussolini and everything went slightly pear-shaped. But this is a really good look at an alternate Italy where there was a futurist utopia, so that's worth looking out for. I don't think this has actually ever been paperbacked, so good one, Bruce. So I begin with Sterling, I go back to him at the end. So if I missed anybody out, and I mean from the 1980s, so anybody I've missed out that I haven't mentioned, pop them up. I think we've mentioned pretty much all the key people there, thanks to a quick look through Mirrorshades. And is there any real cyberpunk after 1989, 1990? Probably not, I would say. Really, people need to leave the idea of subgenres behind. They flower briefly and the great work comes along, and everything that comes on afterwards is pretty much copyist, and it's not worth looking at. You know, it's you need fresh ideas. That's the thing with SF, needs fresh ideas. Hope you've enjoyed looking at those books. I'll see you again soon. Do watch the videos linked at the end of this video. Like, comment, subscribe. The club room is still $4.99 a month for an exclusive video every week, and I'll see you again soon. Bye for now.